Well, there are two sort of existing guides that help tourists navigate museums. One is a general guide that includes hotels and restaurants and usually has just about one page or sometimes even less on each museum. Then the individual museums publish their own catalogs, which often include every work on display, and it's much more than most tourists can handle on one visit. So rather than having to buy separate museum guides at each museum you go to, I had the idea to have one guide that would cover all of the museums in one city. So you'd buy one guide that's portable, it has images of all of the works so you keep it as a souvenir, and it allows for just the right level, I hope, of in-depth background information and sort of explanation of each work of art that is just the right amount for most tourists who want to know the reason why they should go see certain works of art, that can help them choose which works of art to see, because some of the museums like the Prado are so big, have so many wonderful works in them, it can be difficult to choose. So the idea is to create a guide that is more personal and feels like you have an art history professor who's also a friend walking with you through the galleries. Well, I love art in Spain, and I actually think that Madrid is probably the single best place in the world to study art history. It has the most of my personal favorite paintings. And it seemed logical because I had this conversation with my publisher of my novel, El Ladrón de Arte, which is published with Sesbaral, which is an imprint of Planeta. And we were speaking about the idea of this book about 2 years ago now at a dinner in Bilbao. And I wrote to Olga Villanova, my editor at Planeta, and told her about the idea, and she liked it right away. And it seemed like it made sense to start with the 4 largest tourist attractions in terms of 3 cities and 1 area in Spain, with the idea that we could always expand to cover other areas in Spain and even perhaps Portugal as well. It's a very personal selection, which was a lot of fun for me. For me, going to a museum is like going to a candy store, and I just love everything. So for me, it was about choosing a balance between the most famous works, which people expect to see when they go to the museum, and a selection of what I would call hidden gems, works that people might overlook, but that have a really fascinating story behind them, or can tell us something about the history of art that would otherwise slip beneath the radar of most tourists. So we tried to balance with about half very famous iconic pieces and half pieces that hopefully will become iconic for the people who visit them. I trained as an art historian, and I did all my postgraduate degrees in art history, and it was my first love. But I also was interested in creative writing, and I actually started as a playwright, and I wrote 11 plays when I was a student, and I thought I wanted to be a playwright. But I liked the idea of perhaps trying to write a novel, and my first agent, a long time ago, who retired and is no longer an agent now, said the plays are okay, but it would be much better for a new young writer to write a novel. So I decided to try it, and I wanted to set a novel behind the scenes in the art world, which I think people find intriguing, but they don't know that much about. So I wanted to provide an insider's view of auction houses and academia and museums, and I decided to set a crime within the art world. And I couldn't choose between forgery or smuggling or theft, so I did a little bit of everything. And the idea is that it is an intelligent thriller that is entertaining, and you finish it and you think, wow, that was really fun. But once you're finished, you know much more about art history, and art crime than you did when you started. But you're not quite sure where you learned it, because it was too much fun along the way. At least that's the idea. Well, I founded a nonprofit think tank and research group called ARCAA, the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art, and primarily we act as a bridge between international police departments, academics who study art crime, and museums and the art world, trying to work together to help curb art crime and use the study of history to suggest possible explanations for why a crime occurs and help prevent crimes and recover art in the future. So one example would be, in 2005, a Henry Moore sculpture was stolen from England. It weighs about a ton, and it's made of solid bronze. And the idea behind the investigation was, what can you do with this? It's absolutely enormous. It's 10 feet long. It's difficult to hide. And looking into the history of art crime, we could understand a couple of things. One, that there's a historical precedent for stealing bronze sculptures, not for the value of the sculpture, but for the value of the raw materials, the bronze itself. And two, looking more macroscopically at crime indexes around the world, we saw that worldwide there was a rash of thefts of objects that are made of bronze and copper, which coincided with the rise in price of the raw materials in the preceding 6 months before the theft. So putting two and two together, we could see that not just artworks, but things like garden ornaments and drain pipes from roofs, anything made of bronze and copper was being stolen. So the assumption was, unfortunately, that it was stolen simply because someone saw it, didn't think it was a Henry Moore sculpture, which was insured at a value of £2 million, but instead saw that it was a giant lump of bronze. So that it was probably stolen, cut into pieces, melted down, and sold maybe for as little as £1,500. So that's the sort of example how the history of art crime can help provide information about why crimes occur and help suggest better ways to protect art and recover art in the future. There's absolutely a romance about that, and in the popular media and in fiction, literature and film, that idea is cultivated. And before World War II, there were a number of high-profile art thefts that did fit more in line with the romantic idea. The thefts were individuals, so it was not a situation where an organized crime group was profiting, therefore it felt less threatening and sinister, and it was often as much ideological as financial, the reason for the crime. That said, there are a very small group of passionate thieves or collectors who have been involved in art crime that we know of. There certainly might be more that we don't, but one very famous one is Picasso, who was involved in a theft from the Louvre in 1907 of Iberian statue heads that he wound up using as models for his famous painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And just in 2008, there was a scholar called Farhad Hakimzadeh who was stealing maps from the British Library just because he loved them. He was actually a millionaire with a huge map collection of his own, and he didn't try to sell anything that he stole, but he just kept it because he loved it. And he was finally caught, but it's almost difficult to be as upset with someone like that than with an organized crime group that's involved in terrorist activity. But from my perspective, it's critical to preserve the art at all costs. So I try to dispel the romance as much as possible while still taking advantage of the inherent interest that the general public has in art crime to try to get them to listen and to learn more about it. Thank you very much.